Cooldowns in Path of Exile can be a little bit triggering, especially because if you get one little thing wrong, you attack too fast, all of a sudden your build is bricked. There is a very excellent thread on Reddit maintained by Psychomap that has all of the cooldown thresholds and all of the trigger breakpoints all laid out in a really nice format. So if you prefer to read rather than watch videos, I will have that down in the description below, and I did use that to double check all of my information before making this video, because it is an amazing resource and it's been incredibly well maintained even with the game changing so much from league to league. I was recently asked by Shack Central, who you might know from Cold Dot for Everyone, to make a video breaking down various trigger thresholds. And it's something that I've been meaning to do for a while anyway, as whenever I use a trigger skill in a build, I do link the Reddit post because it's an excellent resource. This way I can link that, and I can also link a video and I can say, hey, if you hate reading, because I know most PoE players hate reading, you can watch this instead and you'll get the same information. So if you're a fan of builds that use trigger skills, be sure to sub to the channel, leave a like, and ring that bell, as I'm going to be uploading videos about them in the future. But now, to answer the first initial question that I get asked a lot when I say you need a specific attack speed and you need to keep an eye on your cooldown recovery rate, why should I care? The simple answer is you should care because your DPS will be cut in half if you don't. The way most trigger skills work is you attack, the attack triggers a skill, the skill then goes on cooldown, and you attack again, triggering it, and so on and so forth. So what happens if you attack slightly too fast? Well, to use my Forbidden Right character as an example here, if I put my attacks per second too high, you'll notice my trigger rate almost halves itself. This is because I attack, the trigger skill is still on cooldown, and then I have to attack again before the trigger skill will go off. The second problem that a lot of people run into when it comes to trigger skills is you can't just go, oh, well, as long as I attack slower, I'm good, right? Wrong. This is because Path of Exile uses what are called ticks for its servers. What ticks do is they break down information into bite-sized chunks rather than processing it in real time. Path of Exile uses 30 tick servers, meaning in 1 second there's 30 individual ticks of about 33 milliseconds apiece. In other words, even if your attack speed is slightly slower than the cooldown for the trigger skill, you might attack and also have it come off cooldown in the same tick, in which case it hasn't already processed that it comes off cooldown, so your attack is wasted, it comes off cooldown, and you have to attack again, which is the same problem we were trying to avoid earlier. So to catch everyone up to this point, and to summarize just a little bit, you always need to attack slower than your trigger cooldown, and you need to account for server ticks when doing so. This results in hard breakpoints, and I'm going to go over breakpoints for several of the popular ways of playing trigger skills. This won't be quite as in-depth or extensive as the Reddit thread. Again, it's down in the description. You can check that out if that interests you more. Starting, of course, with the 150 millisecond cooldown most commonly used by cast on crit strike support. Without any sort of cooldown recovery rate, you will need roughly 6.6 attacks per second because it has a cooldown of around 165 milliseconds. This is the base 150 plus the amount of time the server will take to actually calculate that it's off cooldown. The first breakpoint, and the one that you will see most often in budget cast on crit strike builds, is 14% cooldown recovery, which turns it into a 32 millisecond cooldown. This one ends up aligning pretty neatly with the internal server ticks anyway, which is quite interesting. For that, you need 7.57 attacks per second. And that's why most of the cast on crit strike cost breeze builds have an attack rate of 7.5 attacks per second, give or take a little bit. Then finally, the last relevant breakpoint I'm going to discuss is getting the cooldown all the way down to 99 milliseconds. Before this league, this was quite difficult, but if you're using an awakened cast on crit strike, you have elevated cooldown boots or a cooldown belt that's tier 1, and your cast on crit strike gem is level 6 in a plus gems chest piece, or you're using an abyss jewel with cooldown recovery rate, you can have a 99 millisecond or about 0.1 second cooldown on your cast on crit strike, which means you can have an attack rate of about 10.1 APS. Although I would undershoot that a little bit, as I've noticed as I get close to the 10.0, my latency does seem to interfere with that just a little bit. And you might find that with any of these breakpoints, so always a little bit under is preferable because if you go over due to latency, your skill's still on cooldown, and we have the same problem I mentioned earlier in the video. Now, another very common and quite variable version of a trigger build is to use Spellslinger. Spellslinger turns a spell into a pseudo-aura, and it triggers it when you attack with a wand. Since we're attacking with wands and not Cyclone, this means our attack rate's probably going to be lower, which works out quite well because Spellslinger has a much longer base cooldown than 150 milliseconds. Of course, it varies based on the gem, and I'm going to skip going over every single gem level. If you care about that, check the Reddit thread. But at level 20, it's about 396 milliseconds, which means a 2.52 attacks per second ratio is what you're going to aim for. However, if you're playing Spellslinger, it's very common to have the Spellslinger increased cooldown recovery rate helmet and something like cooldown recovery on belt. So the other very relevant breakpoints I'm going to talk about are 82%, which would be if you just had the Spellslinger helm enchantment, and that is a 330 millisecond cooldown, or 3.03 attacks per second, and 103%, which is a 297 millisecond cooldown, or 3.36 attacks per second. For most Spellslinger builds, you probably won't be exceeding 3.36, although it is currently possible due to cooldown recovery on Abyss Jewels. And then finally, since cast on damage taken builds are a little bit more popular these days, they're still mostly a meme, but let's just pretend that they continue to get support and continue to rise in popularity in future leagues, and I eventually make one. For a 250 millisecond cooldown skill, what you need to do is again start with a base rate. This base rate starts at 264 milliseconds, which is 3.78 attacks per second. Again, very doable even if you're not using Cyclone. In this case, we don't have the advantage of Awakened cast on crit strike, which does make it fairly difficult to scale, especially since there's no nifty helm enchant either. But you'll want at least a little bit of CDR, because if you get a little bit, you go down to 231 millisecond effective cooldown, or 4.32 attacks per second, which is about 20% more damage. And then finally, the last breakpoint, which I think a lot of people would be able to reach, is 27%, which lowers the cooldown to 198 milliseconds and has an equivalent APS of 5.05 attacks per second. Hopefully this video has helped to serve as a basic introduction to the mechanics behind cooldown recovery, cast on crit strike, Poet's Pen, Spellslinger, and cast when damage taken, along with giving you a better understanding of why you need a specific APS if you're playing one of these builds, and what that number should be. There will be timestamps for each of the different trigger types, as I know most builds will only use one of them, so you can jump back and reference it whenever you play the build. And again, I know I've said this a lot, but I do want to stress that the Reddit thread is very detailed and has a ton of information, including for a bunch of different cooldowns that I didn't cover in this video. So do please check that out down in the description below. So now my question to you is, have you played any of the skills or builds that rely on cooldowns, which I mentioned in this video? If not, are you planning to play one in the near future? And what other mechanics in Path of Exile tend to confuse you? I'd love to hear about all that down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. And again, a special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. If you want to support me, you can do so by clicking the links down in the description below or on screen right now. You can also support by making purchases through my Nexus page. Or if you just want to chill and hang out, be sure to join the Discord. Again, links for everything are down in the description below. Thank you, and have a great day.